This year is dedicated to the memory of Rachaleah Bas Rav Chaim Tzvi. This week's Parsha is Parshat Bo. And continuing some of the subjects that we began last week, I wanted to talk about the Makos, the plagues. And mainly, what's the reason for these plagues? Why did Hashem bring them upon the Egyptians? Were they for the Jews? Were they for the Egyptians? Already last week, we spoke about why Hashem hardened Paro's heart, and we explained then that it was for two reasons. So that the Egyptians should know that God exists, and so that the Jews should also know that God exists. Both of them are supposed to come to a greater understanding of God. We spoke about how the Egyptians have to actually learn to believe that God is here, and the Jews were supposed to learn something about God's behavior in this world, the way He relates to the world. But what about all the plagues? What's the reason for them? So let's begin and see the reason the Torah gives us for these plagues. Let's first turn to chapter 7, verse 17. And because the plagues cover two parshios, Va'era and Bo, we're going to be going through both parshios. Just like last week, we also discussed both parshios. So again, chapter 7, verse 17. Hashem says to Moshe, Ko Amar Hashem, so says God, so said God, Bezos Teda, with this you will know, Ki Ani Hashem, that I am God. Hine Anochi Makeh b'mateh asher biyadi. Behold, I am going to hit with the staff in my hand, Al Hamayim asher bayor, to the water that's in the Nile, v'nefchu l'dam, and they will become blood. V'adaga asher bayor tamus, and the fish in the Nile will die. Uva'ash hayor, and the whole Nile will start to smell and become disgusting. And the Egyptians are going to try, but they're going to be unable to drink water from the Nile. So here, at the very beginning of all 10 plagues, of all 10 Makos, we're told, why is Hashem sending these plagues? So that you, Paro, should know that I am God. And not just you, Paro, but the Egyptians. And we also know not just the Egyptians, but also the Jews. So the first reason for the plagues is so that the Egyptians and Paro should learn that Hashem is God. Why else does Hashem bring the plagues? Is this the only reason that He gives? No. So let's look later on the Parsha to see what reason He gives for these plagues. Let's turn now to chapter 8, verse 18. This is right before the plague of Arov, of the wild animals, the fourth plague. And there Hashem says, V'flesi bayom hahu es eres Goshen, and I'm going to separate on that day the land of Goshen, asher ami omer aleha, that my nation is standing upon it. L'vatiha yosham sham arov, so that the wild animals will not go there. Lama'an teda, so that you should know, ki ani Hashem, that I am God, Bikerev haaretz, in the midst of the land. And here we have the second reason for the plagues, not just that you know that I am God, but that you know that I am God within the land. What else? Are there any other reasons? And yes, there are. There's one more reason given for the plagues. Turn to chapter 9, verse 14, where we have the plague of hail. That's where that plague is introduced. Let's begin. And Hashem says to Moshe, say the following, go to Paro and tell him the following. Ki bapam hazos, because at this time, ani sholech et kol magefosai, I'm going to send all my plagues, elipcha, to your heart, uva'avadecha uva'amecha, and to your servants and your nation. Ba'avor teda, so that you should know, ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz, that there is no one like me in all the land. So we have three reasons why Hashem is bringing the plagues. Number one, so they know that God exists. They should know, Ki Ani Hashem, that I am God. Number two, L'ma'an teda Ki Ani Hashem b'karev haaretz, so that you know that I am God within the land. I don't just exist, but I actively control what's happening in this world. And number three, Ba'avor teda Ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz, so that you know there is no other God, there is no other power, there is just Hashem. One God who controls and manipulates the world. So the question is, how do the plagues teach these messages. How do they teach these messages? We said to Paro, to the Egyptians, and somewhat even to the Jews. Sforno explains, let's see what he says. Let's turn to chapter 8, verse 12 to see how he explains how the plagues bring about these messages and teach them to the Egyptians. Again, chapter 8, verse 12. This is actually the third plague, the plague of kingdom of lice, and this is what Sforno says. וזה כי 9 המכות שהיו לאותות ולמופתים היו דצח עדש באח בלבד. כי מכס וחורס לא הייתה לעוס ולא למופס, אבל הייתה לעונש כמובאר למעלה. First, Sforno explains the following. He says we have 10 plagues, but not all the plagues are created equal.